Okay. Hello, YouTube world. We're going to be starting shortly. Okay. Okay. Well, we're going to start letting everyone in. All right. Welcome, everyone. Well, welcome everyone as they keep filing in. So hello, YouTube. I think we're there. Got another 1 sec. Hi, everyone. I'm getting lots of thumbs ups. All right, that's cool. That's cool. Right. So everyone's well? I suppose we can have a muted conversation. You can sign language and I'll just Harry, very good. Very good. Although because I don't read sign language, I have no choice but to just think that you know what you're talking about, which is like people like think with me. If I speak fast enough with enough Hebrew words, people just assume I know what I'm talking about, and they put full trust. Now, I'm quite excited about having David with us. He's just coming on. So for those of you who don't know David, he's actually, I made a mistake. He was very, very upset because I said that he's a captain in the army, but actually he's a major. He's had a promotion, and I haven't kept up with everything that's going on in my own mate's life. So he said, "Oh, you can have Captain David Gutnick, but I'm Major David Gutnick. So find someone else." But his on Tuesday night, David is actually he actually is on army time right now, and if he gets a call, he actually has to drop out, as I mentioned earlier. So here he is. G'day, David. I made it sound far more dramatic. I said you're on army time, which could mean that it's 2002 for you, but it's that if you do get that call, your whatever calls you're on, I assume it's pastoral care and welfare support. What is it that you're doing on a random Tuesday night out in fatigues?
Yeah, well, I'm not in fatigues at the moment, but we've got
You've gone undercover.
Yeah, we've got a lot of members that are deployed with COVID assist at the moment, so that's a big pastoral responsibility. And yeah, there's just some people starting to do it tough a little bit and get a bit stressed and challenged. So that's mostly phone calls, and sadly, with the Defence Force, you've always got to keep an eye out for people with trauma and suicide awareness and these types of things. So yeah, they know where to find me. I got a call about 5 minutes before Shabbos with a bit of a drama, and yeah, hopefully it'll be a quiet night tonight.
What's the just on that for a sec before we even formally start? What's the halacha with that? If you're getting a phone call, it's not a wartime. It's but you are part of the army. So at what are you allowed to answer your phone on Shabbos? Do you have a military phone that, you know, if that phone's ringing, that's got to be someone who's needing your care?
No, I don't. I've set it up that for Shabbos they can call a different chaplain. There's an on-call chaplain in Victoria, and they call that number. But I have to pay them back when it comes to Easter or their holidays. I've got to make myself available and make sure every year on Xmas Eve I'm carrying the duty phone for the chaplains in Victoria, and that's my compense. But it's a going joke, that after all they're celebrating somebody who was Jewish.
I thought you were going to say that's a cross that you have to bear. But,
Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
So halachically, if Shabbos begins and you're on the phone, I suppose it's no different to Hatzalah in that there's the idea of Ava. You can't say, no, I'm only responding to Jewish people, not non-Jewish. You just carry on with the call.
Yeah, there's been lots of interesting dilemmas with defence. Like I was once on an exercise in Canberra at the Majura training complex, and Shabbos arrived, and my biggest issue was carrying, because that's a big. People don't realise it. Even if there is a mechitza, even if there is a fence all the way around, if that is an open area with trees that are not there for shade, they're just there naturally. If it's a large open tract of land, that there still might not be a proper eruv, and you may not be able to carry. So I wasn't sure of the status, and I'm still not. So as Shabbos came in, it was considered, and that's the cleverness of the army. They turn everything into a training, into some training benefit. And so this was training benefit, and they all had to work out what to do with me, essentially. And so they took my backpack, my pack that was on my back, and they split it up amongst the remaining section members. And then at about 8 o'clock, while everyone else was eating, tinned tuna and dehydrated Tic Tacs or whatever, I was given the opportunity. A car came up, and they delivered me a Friday night dinner meal, kosher from Klein's, chicken and rice and everything, and all. We'd been out bush for about 5 or 6 days at that stage, and so everyone crowded around to see what I was eating. And one of the bravest ones amongst them said, "How does one become Jewish?" just at that very moment. So suddenly 2,000 years of persecution was considered a small price to pay for a solid hot meal on a Friday night out in a training center. So.
Do you ever? I can't believe I've never asked you these things. Do you ever feel embarrassed? Like it's Friday night's coming. Do they know that because you're from, or because you're Jewish, there are going to be some weird things that you're going to ask, or do you have to go, right, here we go. I know you've all got backpacks, but no one's ever told you, but Jews can't carry on Shabbos. Is there an embarrassment, or it's just, this is how it works? And
yeah, it's awkward. It's not you're never embarrassed. Remember that they know about the Sabbath and the day of rest from Christian background and other things, and they're aware of it. And they also know I'm a chaplain. I mean, I walk into the courses and onto the exercises, onto the deploy with a yarmulke and with with big Mogan Davids on the lapel. They know I'm different already. It takes off.
You've also got a beard.
I've got a big beard. But there are some beards in the Defence Force, in the Navy, and even in there's actually a tradition for the Assault Pioneer Sergeant. That's in Darwin, I think at 1 RAR in Darwin, and they have a tradition that that sergeant has a beard because he would handle explosives back in the good old days when they used to make cannonballs themselves, So he would handle explosives, and the tradition was he would touch his eyes and his face and get kind of rashes and burns on his face. So it became kind of a protocol and a minhag in the ADF that the Assault Pioneer Sergeant wears a big beard. And so that's what often I get asked. Are you the Assault Pioneer Sergeant? I'm not the Assault Pioneer Sergeant.
Because I remember when you were in Malakuta and there were all the different pictures of you going around. And so people were commenting how they loved your yarmulke. But then also there were comments about I should become a chaplain. It's the only way to be allowed to wear a beard in the army. Yeah,
that's right. Well, out there, like during the operation for bushfire assist, there were majority of the people out there had beards. There were lots of country bumpkins with big full-grown beards. It actually gave me credibility in the kind of the pastoral rounds.
And by the end of it, that was also, you know, I mean, I was going out there to help those people, but I felt intimidated. Like, these are real country bumpkins. I mean, near Malakuta, there's a small town called Can River, and they've got, you know, people are out there because they don't want to be known. They don't want to be discovered. These are like Unabomber types, you know, they're way off the grid and living off a beaten track. But the fire came through and it just forced them to come out. Like, you know, all of this native fauna came out, and then suddenly, like, these country bum. I mean, I spoke to the local policeman. He said he had no idea people were living out there. You know, this is really off the grid stuff, and they all had big beards and disheveled kind of. And in the end, it kind of, like, I fit in really well. Really well. It was like, at one stage, I think they thought I was one of them, but it was it kind of worked out well. By the end of it, you know, they all, you know, I actually found some Jewish people living out there, and Chabad of Rara put me in touch with some as well. So I was able to do rabbi work as well as just general pastoral care.
Is that okay? Are you allowed to do that when you're?
Yeah, I'm encouraged. So you know, they know I got brought in because Greg Scher was killed, an Australian soldier was killed in Afghanistan in 2009, and that's when they asked for a rabbi, and I was the only one at the time. How come you didn't put up your hand? I don't know why I was the only one that got suckered into that. They showed me a video of guys jumping out of helicopters and things, and I thought, this is. And
you were like, yeah, that's me.
That's it. It took me 12 years to get into my first helicopter, but they yeah, I think kind of they expect that I'll look after Jewish members. There's about 500 Jewish Defence Force members in Australian Army, in the Australian Defence Force and the 3 services that we know of. So they expect that, but at the same time, they deploy you or they post you to a unit or to an operation. They expect you to give that, you know, a priority as well. So that's why tonight I'm posted now to the Melbourne University Regiment, and I'm on call tonight for them. And obviously I'll jump onto the Defence Network and, you know, touch base with everyone. We've got like these private secure networks that we can do our work online, you know, away from prying eyes and trouble.
But you won't be walking the streets at all in uniform, because
at the moment,
I presume everyone that's doing it are from Melbourne or Victoria, as opposed.
No. They've flown in. So most of Victoria is an army reserve. So that means that we're only part time, and a lot of us aren't able to give full time at the moment. So there are ready battalions across Australia if, let's say, a war were to break out quite suddenly. And every year it's a different battalion or a brigade that is responsible for a rapid response. So when it was the bushfires, it was a battalion from Adelaide, an infantry battalion from Adelaide that were the first ones to the bushfire response. So they've brought in the full-time army personnel, but this is a very specific requirement. So they're looking for logistics and medical corps. So this is, you know, only particular battalions or regiments or whatever, as they're called, would be available to do this. So it's combat support battalion. So that's where I was posted last year in Broadmeadows. And that would be a logistics personnel and a medical personnel and even things like catering if need be. I stayed close to the caterers. They were clean. They were keen to develop a Jewish menu, a kosher menu as well. So there is a ready battalion, and they're out here now. And I've seen them on Fitzroy Gardens next door, where I live here in East Melbourne. And I've seen them walking around, and it's a very small community, the Defence Force. So they recognise me, and I recognise them, and it's very nice.
Oh wow! Before we move on from all things green and fatigued.
Yes.
Does anyone want to ask David anything?
We don't want to fatigue your congregation.
No, definitely not.
Boom,
boom.
Boom, boom, boom.
All right. Well, everyone's obviously very much their cup is full. Only goodness shall know their way from here. So, where one of the interesting things. I'd say that right now, outside of conversations around membership and all that jazz, there is a genuine intrigue around the idea of using Zoom over Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and Orthodoxy considering making changes for the greater good and things like that. And I've been working on putting a share together for the community, but I found that in this period, already going back to Pesach and post Purim, in some ways, I would say there are Sforim, there are books that we're opening, and when I say we, I mean the royal we, that we're opening to explore areas of halacha that probably were not really even dusted off in the last 50 years. Would you say that that you're finding that you're becoming more interested in areas of halacha that just didn't even know really mattered, like the replacement prayer for Kaddish and things like that? Is that at all something that you've got lost into?
Yeah, but it's I mean, there's so much difficulty about this situation, and in the pastoral care and rabbinic capacity, it weighs on me, not the concern, for ourselves and our families. We're relatively secure, and we have, we're ensconced, surrounded by really supportive congregations and boards of management or whatever it is. But it's such a worry for some of our congregants, and it's kind of like, with that aside, and hard to say that, but with that aside, it's been an extraordinary thing to live through because of the opportunities that it's opened up. And for the example of the Zoom, the classical Zoom share, where I was sitting in East Melbourne, on a Monday at midday on a lunch break, and a few workers would come in and study with me, and there was only a handful of people that would study, and then we're forced to move that class onto Zoom. And suddenly there's, a doubling or tripling of the attendees in the study. And in my mind, I'm thinking, why wasn't I doing this until now? Why did it force, a virtual apocalyptic end of times event to make me consider an alternative form of communication with my congregants? And I'm, I mean, it's probably cliche to say opportunities come out of these types of challenges, but there are some extraordinary kind of discoveries, halachic discoveries, rabbinic or pastoral or leadership discoveries. As you'd know, I mean, Menachem, you're one of the creative kind of thinkers in the Melbourne rabbinate. Yeah, I think so. You're one of the broad thinkers. You've got ideas. You're
those shoes, they look very comfortable.
Yes. So it's kind of like, this is the time. This is the time where as a communal leader, some of us didn't really choose this, it chose us type thing, but as a communal leader, we have to come up with novel ideas and meaningful ways to communicate. And I mean, so far there have been some really amazing discoveries personally, and I probably find that I've been a step behind some of the other shuls that I've seen really be quite nimble and very dexterous. But yeah, the halachic side's a big part of that too. But yet, all that being said, the timeless values also help so much. So things like Shabbos and being rigid to some extent, and about the observances of taking ourselves away from the technology and taking ourselves away from those major distractions of the weekday, the work distractions and so on. That's also coming home to roost in a big way at this time.
That's I'm finding, and we've definitely spoken to friends who are rabbis of different shuls or organizations, that I have never appreciated Shabbos as much as this. And I've been thinking a lot about how can I possibly communicate this, the joy of Shabbos, because what I've realized is, number one, we work on Shabbos. So although halachically the definition of work is any of the 39 primary activities that were involved in building the Mishkan, the portable temple when the Jews were in the desert, and then the bylaws of Shabbos are any subsets of those 39 primary areas of law. So work doesn't just mean work, but it means constructive work, and going to shul and preaching is not work, although technically we're not supposed to be paid for it. We're meant to be paid for the preparation time during the week. So a rabbi that doesn't prepare during the week shouldn't be paid for his time on Shabbos. But we go to shul, we shake hands, we give out hugs, we smile, we cry, whatever. When there are 3 people in shul, that's still 3 hours of giving of yourself. There are 100 people in shul. That's 3 hours of giving of yourself. And it's kind of, that's the routine. That's what you do Friday night. That's what you do Shabbos and Shabbos afternoon for those shuls that do it. But and it is slower. We don't have technology and all that. But now the whole nothing from the moment Shabbos begins, our last thing with the community comes to an end. Like that's the end of the final Zoom, candle lighting, and then nothing until Shabbos ends. So there's no technology, there's no email, there's no fundraising, there's nothing that a community member could need from a rabbi on Shabbos. If they need something, they're going to call Hatzalah, or an ambulance or police. And so to have nothing on is really, probably the same thing when you go on holidays, right? So you leave the shul, so you've got someone else in charge. Does it occur to you like, oh, I wonder what's going on in shul right now? Or Shabbos morning, you're on holidays, you think, I hope the guy hasn't said the wrong thing. Oh, whatever.
Yeah.
Done.
The
Even
first
when we're
week.
on holidays, we're not on holidays. And it's like, and obviously like people who like own their own businesses or carry responsibilities, even when you're away, you're not away. And so when we get Shabbos, like it's an incredible switch off now. I've never experienced such a break in my life. And it's the first time I'm really understanding, oh, this is what Shabbos really must be. It's a complete surrender. There's nothing I can do right now that can make money. There's nothing I can do that can connect me to other people except whoever's in my immediate surrounding. Shabbos has become a whole new profound concept because of COVID.
Yeah,
I don't know how as a rabbi I get up and say, I've discovered Shabbos.
Well, for the first time, I'm not working on Shabbos after preaching that for so long. It's an amazing thing. But in Likutei Diburim, it talks about, which is a text written by Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak of Lubavitch, one of the previous rebbes. He talks about this power to almost communicate or relate to another person just through thought alone. It's a bit of a kind of a dramatic concept, but not to him. It wasn't when he's writing kind of his diary. It's written in the form of a diary of sorts or a journal, and he's saying how he was able to link himself to somebody else in another place through thought alone, and it was actually relating to a shul service or I think a festival service, and he said that is the power of shutting down, because that's what we do on Shabbos. We shut down the distractions. We shut down the conformist ways of communication, the obvious ways of communication, and we discover these much more subtle and gentle forms of communication to the point of community. So maybe that's what we're going to discover at some point during this thing, that it's going to be Shabbos morning and just some type of a thought, what's the word? Thought mechanism. Telepathic, something and suddenly my congregants are going to sit bolt upright.
oh, it's going to go that way. It's supposed to.
It's going to go.
Going,
oh no,
I've got to go. There's someone in Brunswick.
It goes both ways. Yeah, but I think this is all part of it. That the silence that allows you to hear, or the stopping that allows you to discover.
And you can't do it during the week. As long as, even if you turn off your phone, you can't do it during the week. What I find, what makes Shabbos so effective is the surrender. I always was curious about people who keep Shabbos and are chain smokers. Like, what do they do the whole Shabbos? How do they deal with it? And I remember speaking to a chain smoker whom you and I both know, and he said when Shabbos goes out, he's itching for a cigarette, but Shabbos morning, it's like his brain knows it's just not accessible, and he doesn't have that craving, and that the craving is only there when he knows on some level that the craving can be fulfilled. And so I think that with Shabbos, a lot of people often think Shabbos is about switching off the phone and switching off everything and not engaging, which actually can be quite torturous. But it's actually not that. Shabbos is about completely surrendering to the fact that we're not. There is nothing that's going to make us turn the phone on. There's nothing that's going to prevent us from davening. There's nothing that's going to stop us from being with wife, children, etc. And that deeper psychological switch off is actually, I think, what Shabbos is, and aligns a lot more with the ideas in Kabbalah on what Shabbos is. On
I'm with
something
you,
else,
mate.
the other interesting thing is in nothing less to do with Shabbos is, you know, that idea that the most important structure in a Jewish community is the mikveh, and that if you have a shul but you don't have a mikveh, you should sell the shul. You often ask people like, what is the most important structure? And people go, oh, the kosher butcher, because without it you haven't got meat. Or well, butchers didn't exist until what, 150 years ago. But actually, people think the shul is a very important thing, or a Jewish day school. But actually, the mikveh is the most important thing, because without the mikveh, and without the ability for women to be able to go to the mikveh, then you don't have intimacy, and we don't have the basis of bringing life into the world. We don't have a happiness between wife and husband as a result of that physical connection. And it's really interesting how now shuls have closed and schools have closed and butchers have closed, and yet the mikveh is probably the only Jewish institution that is truly open and operating, albeit with completely very strict protocols. But it's interesting how that has been the only Jewish organization that's been open.
It is amazing, and you know, when we talk about shuls being closed for these high holidays, it's not, you know, in many ways, it's not the end of the world. The shul is.
Don't say that.
sorry.
Because
it really isn't.
It wasn't the end of the world.
As a structure, you're right. The mikveh, or a place of education, a place of learning, would all come ahead of the communal place of prayer. Prayer is something that can be fulfilled, you know, in isolation, albeit its more optimum form is with a minyan, but it can be performed perfectly or adequately in isolation. So it's an interest, and in fact, when I consider my synagogue, and you know, the you know, some of the variances around attending the synagogue and how they get to shul and all of that, you know, you think how significant is it? And I think on a practical level, you're right, and you know, it's not, you know, the focal point. Things like mikveh are, but I think there is a symbolism to the synagogue, but probably because it does reflect the temple of old, which was the critical structure. Sorry if I just disappeared my batteries. It was a critical structure. The temple was the central structure during the Jewish Commonwealth periods, and so the shul represents that. And in that sense, it's a very symbolic structure, and for it to be closed is very disheartening for a lot of people. It's a great source of identity for a lot of people, even if they don't go. They say, "But I know it's there, and that's important."
It also highlights the Hebrew term for shul being a beis knesset, a bet knesset, being a house of gathering, rather than a beis tefillah, which is a house of prayer. I really think that once we're able to return to shul, I'm not sure if it's just the ability to daven in a particular room that's going to bring people, as much as the ability to do so in a group setting and to be able to come back to that familiar. It really highlights the social side of shul. And not the socializing. It's like that joke of the rabbi that got up and he gave the drasha, "No more talking in shul, you go to hell." And that was it. They stopped talking. And over the next few months, there were all these problems in the town. There was unemployment, and there was sickness, and there were orphans. And the rabbi called the president and the board and said, "What's going on? What is going on in our town? What is this curse?" And they said, "Well, you said stop talking in shul. So now Moshe can't talk to Chaim about so-and-so losing their job, and this one can't organize a doctor for that one, and this one doesn't know that one's in court, so no one's getting any information." And in true, that social construct that is the shul is such an important part, which the beis knesset is such an important thing, especially if you go to old Israel, where you go to Masada or you go to Gamla, where the old Batei Medrash had those steps where the Amoraim would sit and they'd discuss, and shul was really more a conversation around Torah and just a few organized prayers rather than a drawn out prayer with a little bit of Torah in the middle. It probably would have been a far more social environment, not necessarily schmoozy, but the interaction.
So that's the pivot, Menachem. You've nailed the synagogue pivot. The synagogue COVID pivot is
bring talking back.
is bring. You know, because just tonight I had to go to the shul and dig up, because we're doing a bit of a fundraiser at the moment, because we just got this permit and
we've had these plans, and COVID's come and scattered them around a bit. But you know, we've always believed very strongly in this kind of idea of a social centre rather than just a place of prayer. Prayer is important, and communal prayer is important, of course. And anyways, and I was looking through and I found a quote from Victor Smorgon, who was used in one of the marketing or brochures or one of the I don't know, some paper that they prepared for the synagogue when they were trying to fundraise a while ago. And he kind of said, I loved East Melbourne because it was like a Russian marketplace, you know, and not like these modern places of worship, like, you know, which everyone stayed and quiet. What a terrible thing. He's like, it was like a Russian marketplace. He said everyone was talking and yelling. Occasionally the rabbi tried to bang on the central podium to draw some decorum into the space. But when we had Rabbi Kenneth Brander from the Yeshiva University, and he gave us some advice when we were trying to, strategize a bit about the future of a synagogue in the city and all the challenges we were having, he said the temples in Jerusalem were not places of just worshiping God, or certainly not just places of prayer. Prayer was a very peripheral act in the temple. There were obviously sacrifices and so on, but there was also a huge social component. There were places where people went when they were grieving and they could get support. There were places where people needed pastoral support, social support, welfare support, just a bit of music, a little bit of a gig by the Levites, It was,
well, we know that there was a hell of a lot of socializing, because during Beis Rishon, during the first temple, they, what was it, first temple, that they built the upstairs. That wasn't part of the original design of the Beis Hamikdash, and originally men and women were not separated in the Beis Hamikdash, but rather after a number of generations, one of the things that contributed to the separation was the mingling and moving into a far more straight up social affair going on inside the Beis Hamikdash, rather than at least the social construct of religion. It had become extremely pleasant place to hang out. So it must have been a marketplace, to borrow the words of Victor Smorgon. Just
yeah, but I think that's the pivot, because the currency will be, in the COVID safe or post PC post COVID, the currency will be socializing in a safe way, and because we've been so isolated from our socials. So and that's the pivot. That's the community center where you have meaningful interactions with other human beings in a safe. But that's the high currency. I was telling somebody, like, writing a letter with hand on a piece of paper is considered to be a great effort now in the world of emails and text messages and everything. It shows that you really care. You do it like on an anniversary. You write a hand card to a spouse, or before the new year, you write to somebody really. And so the personal contact, the face-to-face contact, will have that kind of currency to it. So maybe that's the shul as a safe social welfare, well-being center with a little bit of prayer occasionally.
I know you need to get going soon. But just on what you just said about writing a nice anniversary card, have you felt so definitely because of lockdown, there's a change. I find there's a complete change to my schedule. Nights, actually, this lockdown nights are a bit more busy, but the last lockdown, it was just like after the sun went down, it was peaceful, and then nothing happened till I got out of my pajamas the next morning. But are you finding that there's a certain change in our routine that's causing, on the one hand, there's the pastoral care side of what we do. Then of course, there is the need to keep creating and finding ways to be able to create content and generate conversations and learning for the community. Then there's still what's going to happen, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, the building plan, everyone's, all the real life things. And then there's family. Are you finding that the whole juggling of family and community is a bit of a challenge right now?
Absolutely. I'm sitting in my bedroom at the moment because it's the only safe space in my house. So I got kids, I wake up in the morning and it's like a call center in my house. There's kids with like earphones with little pieces going around to the front of their mouth, davening with their teachers, answering Chumash questions, doing tests. It's outrageous. And so and so I'm sitting, this is not work, obviously, this is just a friendly schmooze with a friend, but I often am finding myself sitting in my bedroom or in somewhere in my house working late at night, a huge blurring of the lines. Now, rabbis always have struggles with the blurring of the lines. Our phones can ring at 3 a.m. with somebody in distress or God forbid, a tragedy, or please God, a simcha or something. There is a very big work-life balance issue amongst Rabbonim. I've seen it because I grew up, because my father was a rabbi, and I remember him having to leave the house sometimes in the middle of the night because of a domestic dispute on one occasion, or somebody having an episode on another occasion, and
Always
huge
deaths. We
Pardon?
were on holidays in Echuca a few years back.
Mm-hmm.
Got a phone call 2 a.m. Father died. What do we do?
Mm.
So I'm in Echuca. So Chevra weren't picking up, and eventually they got through, but they weren't sure what to do. Eventually, I couldn't get through to my parents. I called a neighbor, told that person how to get into my parents' house. They went in through the garage, knocked on my parents' bedroom door, say, Menachem needs you to pick up your phone. It's 4 a.m. now. My father's like, what is going on? So I said, so-and-so's father, we knew the person was dying and it was they needed a lot of support. Like, this neighbor broke in. It was like, no one slept that night.
Yeah, and I've got, as a kid, so my father was the rabbi out in Doncaster at the time, and and I think maybe we'd already moved. No, I think he was still at Doncaster, and so I think it was a police person came to the door. It was 2 or 3 a.m. Rang the bell. You get a bit of a fright, and he said there's a domestic dispute and they're asking for you, and there was some type of a standoff. I think even involving a weapon, and they wanted my father's pastoral involvement. And I remember just thinking two things. Why does my father need to wear a tie at 2:30 a.m. when he goes out? And second of all, how is my father going to help? He's the shortest. He's all of 5'7", right? And he's never struck me as being particularly robust when it came to wrestling a weapon off somebody or what have. And those were the two questions in my mind. And it was. But these highlight the work-life balance issues, and it's much worse now because everything's being done from home and everything's being done on Zoom, and so what a challenge. So I guess the answer is disciplines, really good disciplines around some of these things. Not successful yet, but there's hope. There's still 3 weeks left.
So you haven't disciplined yourself to find time to learn French, Italian, and how to make pasta. As well,
I do have a terrible concession to make in front of your intimate congregants, Menachem. But I'm just worried that my tablet's going to go. I did sign up for a language course with the Hebrew University in Israel. What happened was I had to give a sermon just before COVID to a huge tour group of Israelis, for one of the Israeli tour groups. I think it was Shai Bar Ilan, or one of these groups that come through the synagogue. And so I said, I'll give my sermon fully in Hebrew. It was an unedifying spectacle. My biblical Hebrew is fine, but my modern Hebrew was poor. So I called up the Hebrew University. I said, do you run just online courses? Yeah, absolutely. They'll give me some academic credits for doing it. They'll give me a bit of a discount. And starting in a couple of weeks, an online Hebrew course with some professor at the Hebrew University, and they allowed me to join at level 6, which was nice of them. So I don't have to learn the Aleph base again. But they said that it starts at level 1, goes to level 8, so I can join at level 6, and I'll improve my. I have taken a language course.
You're the modern day Rabbi Akiva, like yes. Age 40.
Age 40. I just turned 40.
Water making a hole in a rock, and go, if that's what water can do, what can Hebrew do to me?
That's right. But your congregants can know that as well, that there's some really good online courses available to speak biblical Hebrew, modern Hebrew, Aramaic, Yiddish, and you can get academic credits if you're so inclined, or otherwise you can just do it for the fun of it. And my particular class has got 2 students in it. So
and it's as in you and one other person?
Me and one other person.
Oh, fantastic. And a real teacher?
And a real professor, online twice a week, 2 hours a week. And
wow.
Just a kind of a random thought. So 40 years old, I'm Rabbi Akiva, without the rich father-in-law. Who had well satiated dogs.
Yes, as his name.
Hounds, well-fed hounds. Anyways, all good.
And all right, cool. So
Yeah.
so it's just before we finish, and you get back to your night patrol.
Ministering. Yeah, night patrol.
You're ministering. You should have a AM radio station. You're listening to Chaplain David. We've got Tisha B'Av happening over the next in 24 hours time. What are you taking out of Tisha B'Av for yourself? Forget the community. What is Tisha B'Av in the COVID era? Not what is Tisha B'Av in the COVID era, but with everything that's going on, what are you learning out of the Tisha B'Av story?
Tisha B'Av is a joyous day. Sorry, ruined the narrative. Tisha B'Av will be a joyous day. It is an anticipated. So it's actually very personal for me because my bris was on Tisha B'Av, and so a day that most people like to forget. Unfortunately, we have it at an age where we don't retain too much memory of it. Everyone remembers mine because they fasted for 25 hours before the meal that they had, and my parents put on this huge spread. It was in Sydney. And people still walk up to me. I remember your bris. I remember we broke our fast. And when my parents chose a name, they chose one of the names of the Mashiach. Not that I'm afraid I've disappointed them quite terribly in that regard. But the actual idea that this is a day of renewal and rebirth and kind of messianic tidings and all the rest of it. So the suffering we've done that according to every opinion. We covered all our bases on the tragic side of things, on the suffering side. So there's a great kind of, I don't know.
He warned that he might have to go at the drop of a hat. I'll finish something on what David was just saying. I was going to actually share this with him. And that is, I've been listening to a history podcast, particularly Jewish history podcast, and the first temple was destroyed on Tisha B'Av. Well, both temples were destroyed on Tisha B'Av. So the first temple was destroyed 2,500 years ago on Tisha B'Av, and it was destroyed by the Babylonians, by Nebuchadnezzar, who was the general and the ruler of Babylon at the time. And this is not something that just happened out of the blue. There's a real tension between the Jewish leadership, the kings of Israel and Nebuchadnezzar, because Israel was meant to be playing the role of a vassal state at that point. And then you have a series of kings that are like, no, I think we can declare independence. I think we'll be okay. And Nebuchadnezzar has to keep coming back and just reaffirming that he is actually the boss of this neighborhood. And he ends up killing thousands of inhabitants of Jerusalem and taking a whole lot of them into exile throughout Babylon and the Babylonian Empire. And he destroys the temple. However, he doesn't kill everyone. So one of the people he actually has no problem with is Jeremiah, Yirmiyahu is one of the greatest prophets in Jewish history. And Jeremiah has been for years carrying on and walking around saying, we've got to change our behavior, or else Hashem's going to destroy the Beis Hamikdash and the Babylonians are going to destroy it. You're going to see Nebuchadnezzar is going to be the guy who's going to destroy it. We've got to change. And Nebuchadnezzar, because it's a very, very religious world, there's this complete respect for Yirmiyahu, even though he's a Jewish prophet and is by no means pro-Babylon, but because he prophesied supportively, and he says, Nebuchadnezzar is going to take Jerusalem. Nebuchadnezzar says, well, you haven't done anything wrong. You foretold my heroics, so I'm not going to kill you. In fact, if you want, you can stay in Israel. And on the eve of the destruction of the temple, Yirmiyahu actually bought a plot of land just outside of Jerusalem, and he bought it, paid for it. Imagine buying a piece of land in a war zone. It's like what would the equivalent be? It'd be like, imagine 2 years ago, 3 years ago, going onto DamascusRealEstate.com or MosulRealEstate.com and saying, I'd like to buy a plot of land somewhere, preferably in the Islamic State region. Like, please, I'd love to buy it. And what would that land be worth? Who wants it? Who's selling it? And he went and paid money for a piece of land that was very much in a war zone. And this was a declaration of belief by Yirmiyahu, because he also said, the temple's been destroyed, but we're going to be back here. And when we come back, I want my land. I want to be here. I want to be very close to the base of Mikdash. Now, he actually didn't live to see the rebuilding of the temple, but he was correct that 70 years later, the second temple was built. So although this is the day that the first temple was destroyed, it is also the beginning of an exile and the return to Israel when the second temple is built. And on tomorrow night will be also the anniversary of the destruction of the second temple. But just as two temples were, there were prophecies that two temples would be built and two temples would be destroyed. There are further prophecies about a third temple. And so Tisha B'Av, although a negative date, is also a day that tells us there's still a much brighter future ahead for us. So it's interesting that David was called Tzemach. David is his full name, Tzemach being one of the names, and David being King David, of whom Mashiach comes from, the Davidic bloodline. Now, just before we wrap up, and if anyone has any questions for me, and maybe David can call back in after whichever phone call he's got. He's actually WhatsApped me that he has got a call, but he might be able to come back. Tomorrow evening, we are doing something that's not part of the general weekly schedule, but it was sent out on email, and that is we're watching a movie on Zoom. I'm going to be doing a shared screen movie watching. And the movie that we're watching has only recently been put out. It's a documentary movie made by I wouldn't say a friend. I was actually his counselor in camp many years ago, and has gone into movie production. And he makes documentaries, and this is a documentary based on the diaries of the Lubavitcher Rebbe when he was living in Vichy, France during Second World War. And it's very much not a report of what's going on in France at the time. These are his diaries in which he writes about his relationship with God, and particularly during wartime in Europe, what was the nature of his relationship with God for that 2-year period, and how would that go on to inform his life, and how did he rationalize things? So because Tisha B'Av is a Saturday, I've chosen something that does have a Holocaust theme, but because we're living in a time that we don't need to dwell on more negativity than there is already in the world, I thought maybe to look for something that will have a fascinating side to it rather than just a historical and mostly sad side. So that'll be tomorrow evening. Same link to be able to check it. So are there any questions or comments before we wrap up on what some of the things that David and I have spoken about? As I said last week, don't all shout out at once. So I will then bid everyone farewell. Tomorrow we have the Parsha Shiur, and that's at 12:30 till 1:15. It will be a slightly different one. Yes, Michael.
What time is you? Oh, I finally found. What time's your movie tomorrow? Get everything but the time.
Oh, really? Oh, it's at 8. In the email, does it not say that it's at 8?
Not that I can find. I must be very slow.
Oh, sorry. You're right. Wednesday Eve. It's at 8 o'clock. 8 p.m. on your couch. It'll be the most easygoing Tisha B'Av session you've ever had.
Gone with God.
Yes, alone with God. Ben, or someone want to say something?
I have a question.
Okay, go. Yeah.
You said the Tisha B'Av was the destruction of the two temples on that particular date, but I heard somewhere that, in fact, they may not have actually been on the same date. yet we commemorate them on the same date.
Okay. I would need a bit more to be able to argue that point.
I'll try and get more information. I'll send it to you, and maybe next time we get together, if there's more background, you can comment on it.
Okay, I'd love to. Tisha B'Av is a date that definitely is a date that we commemorate and honor things that also didn't happen on Tisha B'Av. In fact, until Yom HaShoah was invented, so Yom HaShoah, which is Holocaust Memorial Day, was something that was only created in the 1950s. Yom HaShoah was created in Israel, and then of course it spread around the world. But before Yom HaShoah, when did they commemorate the Holocaust? When did Holocaust survivors insert their experiences into the annals of Jewish tragedy, of historical Jewish tragedy? And my grandfather actually never commemorated Yom HaShoah. He had certain prayers that he said every year on Tisha B'Av. He'd remember. There were prayers that were written to remember the martyrs of the Holocaust, no different to the martyrs of Spain or Germany during the Crusades or the Temple periods, etc. So Tisha B'Av remains the date that we pretty much remember every terrible history. So I'd be very curious to hear what that's all about, the different dates for the destruction of the temple.
I thought that Nebuchadnezzar started destroying the temple on the 7th, and it didn't burn down completely till the 10th. Is that right?
So if I'm not mistaken, the fire began on Tisha B'Av and kept burning, and also same with when the Romans destroyed the temple. It may have started towards the end of Tisha B'Av or before Tisha B'Av, but the main burning was before Tisha B'Av, and the main burning was on Tisha B'Av, because the Romans have got their own version of history, which was that they were never intending on burning down the temple. They said it was actually just a low-ranking soldier that threw his fiery torch. It was never the intention. I mean, that's you don't really get out of jail for not meaning it, do you? So the temple definitely didn't burn over a 24-hour period. It did burn over a prolonged period, over a course of a few days. But as I said, because Tisha B'Av remains the date already from the desert that many Jewish people died every year on Tisha B'Av, it remains the date, and the uncanny closeness throughout history of things happening around the proximity of Tisha B'Av remains a muzzle, an energy force that we not that we fear, but that we respect exists. So that's a bit of a downer way to finish, but it is Tisha B'Av, and we do finish. We do have to keep the mood a bit more somber. But let's go into that exploration tomorrow night with this Alone with God doco. And so I look forward
sorry, it's Daniel.
G'day, Daniel.
Hi, you can't see my face, but I'm
No.
here with Leah.
Hi.
Hello.
You mentioned fasting for 25 hours.
Yeah.
Can you unpack that a bit and sort of, put in the reasons why and when?
Okay, so the fast begins tomorrow evening, and if you'll permit me, I will. I'll get the exact time. So the fast begins tomorrow evening, and it doesn't just begin. It's got quite a dramatic start. The last thing that we eat before the fast begins is a hard-boiled egg that has been dipped in ash. Now, so the fast begins at 5:31. So at around 25 past 5, we'd sit down on the ground and we'd eat this egg. And the egg is one of the foods that mourners eat after a funeral. It's one of the symbols of the cycle of life. And the ash represents the burning of the two temples. So that is the last thing that we eat as we go into the state of mourning and commemoration. And then the fast goes for 25 hours. Fasting in Judaism is almost always, it's always an act of retreat. It's retreating from the joys of life. And the question is, why are you retreating from the joys of life? So fast days like Tisha B'Av, Asara B'Teves, which is the 10th of Teves, Shiva Asar B'Tammuz, the 17th day of Tammuz, Tzom Gedalia, the fast of Gedalia. These are all because there were tragedies, and we're meant to stop and think about it. Now, when we stop and think about it, the only way to stop and think about it is by abstaining from doing things. Like if someone said, oh, what do I have to fast? I'll watch something, I'll read a book on it. The answer is no, you wouldn't. We'd always be too busy. But if we're abstaining, then we have to fill our time with something. When we're feeling that hunger pain and we're feeling that emptiness and we're feeling that parched throat, we start asking, why am I having to go through this? And we start remembering, what is it that is making me feel this pain? And the pain is the distraction, and that then gets me reflecting on the suffering that was experienced, and also the cause of that suffering. And the cause of that suffering is almost always sinas chinam, is almost groundless hatred of one another. Although with the temples, although that is the reason for the destruction given for both temples, there's also in the first temple that there was a complete breakdown of family values and the respect of marriage. So we have people just sleeping around with one another and just eroding away at the idea of commitment. There was idolatry, and there was killing was pretty much completely in vogue. It was all the rage. There were kings who would just order the complete destruction of towns and villages. There were mafias that would kill each other. And so that complete erosion of the value of life is what led to the destruction of the temple. Ultimately, that's what the prophets say. So we sit and we fast and we think about the terrible things that happened, as well as the reasons for them. And then we go, well, I suppose if I embody any of those characteristics, I should change it. So the fast is very much to make us feel the pain and focus on it, and to empathize. So they suffered. I'm going to put myself through a bit of that so that I can empathize with. So when it's not to punish ourselves as much as to be able to reconnect with the pain and suffering. Now, the only fast that's different is the fast of Yom Kippur. And that's a fast because I don't want to eat. I'm moving into a state of transcendence. I'm moving into an angelic state. I don't want to get bogged down with the physicality of food and drink. But that's why we also dress differently. And Tisha B'Av is not a mourning day or a sad day. It's a very serious day. It can be quite an exhilarating day. So the Tisha B'Av fast is about that distraction. And it goes from sunset till nightfall the following night. So it's a total of 25 hours. And even then, when we break our fast and we can drink and eat, we actually still don't eat meat for another 18 odd hours until midday the next day. And that's because meat is a symbol of joy and wine is a symbol of joy. And the temple, although it had been destroyed, it was still burning. There were still smoldering ashes the next day. And so therefore we wait out that full period. So it's a 25-hour fast, and we complete the 9 days of abstention from meat and wine and music until midday the following day. That's the story behind that. Does that?
Yeah. I find it interesting, the mentality or your mindset to different fasts throughout the Jewish calendar. I found that bit of the what you were just saying fascinating.
Yeah, and when you said that it can be exhilarating, it's interesting that that's a mindset that you connect to. But say I'm doing the fast, how do I get to that point of, the differentiation of the headspace?
So I feel that this year Yom Kippur, because in fact we're not going to be able to go to shul, we're going to be in a situation where we're finally going to be able to possibly find ourselves in an exhilarating Yom Kippur. It's a bit like people go on these Vipassana meditation retreats, and for 10 days they're not talking or doing anything with anyone outside of, unless it's their turn to do the gardening or to do the cooking or to do the cleaning. And there might be a moment to talk with whoever's leading the meditation, just to, if there's something that's seriously wrong. And you'd be like, who would want to go on a retreat where there's no TV, there's no radio, there's no communication, there's just sitting in silence for most of the day? Like, sounds crazy. And then some people talk about, oh yes, but after day 5 or 6, I started feeling very different and it was amazing. So it'd be like, well, that sounds a bit kooky, but it's actually quite enlightening. For the first time ever, we're not going to be thinking on Yom Kippur about what we're wearing, or whether the rabbi is carrying on, or whether the chazan could go faster, or whether the seat that we're sitting on is comfortable, or whether this is the right way to honor the tradition. We're going to be stuck at home. And for the first time ever, Yom Kippur is going to be about that spiritual communion and that journey within and upwards. It's going to be about getting out of bed and not eating and finding a corner of the house to just sit and be silent, and maybe we'll even daven. And davening is a meditative experience. So we'll finally be able to get away from all the distractions of shul and get to the essence of what Yom Kippur is. Now, that's going to be a challenge for a lot of people, because for a lot of people, the shul experience is the joy of Yom Kippur. But the spiritual significance of Yom Kippur is not about just heading over to shul and checking in with God and then leaving. It's about going on this personal journey. And so maybe this year we're going to be able to frame the Yom Kippur experience as exhilarating. I will tell you now, often Yom Kippur fast ends, and then it takes a good 45 minutes till everyone leaves shul. And then I'll go home and pick up Rochel, and then we go to Rochel's grandparents' house every year to break the fast. I often don't eat until I get there, which is a good hour and a half after Yom Kippur. And I'm high as a kite. I'm just flying, and everyone knows, like, I surf an absolute wave at Spirit Grow. Like, I find that there's such a powerful vibe that there is actually no need for food by the time we get to that point. I almost never want those last few minutes of Yom Kippur to finish. I always found it strange. Why are there people rushing out? Surely they're not that hungry. And like the focus on, oh, I've got guests coming, I've got to take it. It's like going to the toilet during the car chase scene in a James Bond movie. I mean, you're missing the most important part. So I think this year we've got the greatest chance of having exhilarating Yom Kippurs because of the situation we're in.
I look forward to that.
I've just really built it up.
You built it up.
Yeah.
It's remotely possible that in 2 months' time, the situation will change and that people will be able to meet again.
It is very, very possible for it to change. If we go based on precedent and what's happened up until now, if we can go to shul, they'll be in limited numbers. But if we can have full numbers, I think it'll still be exhilarating, because people will be, as I was talking earlier with David, people are just going to be like, wow, we can come together to this Beit Knesset. It'll really bring that social factor of shul back, and I think it'll be equally exhilarating. And may it be, in fact, let's take it a step further. It could just as well be, and I don't say this cheekily, I say this very honestly, it could very well be that we're going to spend this Yom Kippur in the temple. I mean, I look at the world today and I see a world that is just so ready for a true revolution of society. I mean, people always complain that leadership is dead and there's no good quality leadership in the world. Elected governments don't really control things, because economies now are based on the internet, and we have currencies that are deregulated through cryptocurrency, and communication is no longer bound to particular telecommunication companies, but it's through this social network, and the barriers of the world have completely changed. We've got people calling out for absolute leadership, like, this is ridiculous. How can you shut a whole country down? This is ridiculous. Or how could you be so selfish and go to work? And money is evil, and it's the devil. And the whole Black Lives Matter thing, and this desire for protection of life, and the celebration of minorities. Like, the world's just gone berserk, not nuts, but berserk. So that if there is a philosophy that is presented, and there is a leadership that exists, it could very well actually capture the imagination of the world more now than ever before. Mashiach need not be some crazy, like a guy's going to come down on a cloud on a magic carpet. Mashiach is a wave of change that is going to go through the world. It's a global altruism, a global spirituality. It's a betterment of humanity, of society, of the environment. If you think about it, who doesn't want that? And which protest on the street is not actually underlyingly about that? So I think 2 months. Why not be in a temple? It won't necessarily be the most beautiful temple, but why not be in this reality of a much more beautiful world? You're right. Anything can happen, and I believe that something is going to happen. I mean, the world's ready for all sorts of good things to happen now. So why shouldn't it happen? And that's my.
I have another question.
Go, Harry.
Okay, so we're talking 2,500 years ago, and then 2,000 years ago for the destructions of the temples.
Yeah.
Then we had a whole lot of debacles in between, but one of the other major ones, of course, was the Inquisition 500 years ago.
Yeah.
And then we've had the Holocaust. Now, we're still in the first, second, and third generation post-Holocaust. We've had 500 years to think back on the Inquisition, and now we tend to look at it as more of a historical situation rather than the way we look at the Holocaust, because we are still much closer to it as sort of the remnants and the phoenixing of the community. I'm just wondering in terms of the psychology and the trauma of the respective communities for each of those particular debacles, would they have been similar? Why is it that we tend to reflect on the destruction of the 2 temples, and we're now very much still in the discussion about the Holocaust, but not a lot's thought about of the Inquisition?
Okay, that's a very, very, very good question. Based on history, the memory of the Holocaust will go down the same way as the memory of the Inquisition did, and eventually that will become like the Crusades. It'll be something that happened and nobody really knows what the numbers were, just because, not nobody, as in we don't learn in school. Like, how many people got killed how many Jews got killed in the Holocaust? 6 million. Like, boom. Inquisition, I don't know exactly, but we know there were hundreds of thousands of people in Spain and Portugal. Okay, so obviously around then, Crusades, people don't know. So eventually history forgets itself. And the Holocaust will be no different, no matter how many monuments we build now, go forward 200-300 years. Monuments don't last forever, no matter how much we would like them to. We're still in the shadow of the Holocaust because we still have people who were there, and in 25 years we won't, and we'll still have the children of the Holocaust survivors, but that shadow will eventually get shorter and shorter. It's already getting shorter. My generation, then the generation after mine, have very different relationships or lack relationship with the Holocaust, for the good and the bad. And eventually it will be relegated to another tragedy in a long line of tragedies that happened in Jewish history. Now, the trauma that the people experienced after, let's say, the Spanish Inquisition, while we don't have psychology textbooks to be able to really define them and report them, it definitely existed, and people were displaced for 80 to 90 years. And what we have are the personal journeys and tales that are told by those people, whether it be Rambam, who, he has to find his way to Egypt, and his family are in North Africa, and then they're in Egypt, and then he's eventually buried in Tiberias. And there's a lot of wandering around, like think about the Jews of Amsterdam. Where did they come from? They didn't just go Portugal, Amsterdam. These people had been literally roaming Europe for 80 to 100 years before eventually that part of the world had broken away from the church and from Spain. And so, yes, there was this opening of borders, but people were displaced, and there's a lot of pain and suffering that goes with that. But if we also look at the macro picture of Jewish history, these things always give rise to other things. So post-Spanish Inquisition, we end up with some really incredible growth in Greece and then Israel. We've got the era of the Kabbalists that really comes up. We've got the birth of Polish Jewry, and there are all sorts of new things that spring out of every tragedy. That's not a justification for the tragedy, but I suppose it's how our people deal with tragedy and eventually overcome the traumas, because we get lost in the next round of comforts, good comforts. It's remarkable on a Jewish historical and probably any historical level that within 5 years after the Holocaust, not only was there was a country, but that country had already sown real roots into the ground. Less than 5 years. That's an incredible turnaround from tragedy to creation. And then if we look at the Jewish world today, it's an absolutely bustling reality. There's so much academia, there's so much intellect, there's so much wisdom. There's been so much success of a people that were broken just 75 years ago. And so over that period, we begin, the trauma wears off and it just becomes a part of our heritage. Why do the Beis HaMikdash still remain the constants? Because the answer is because all the tragedies that have happened in Jewish history are all pegged on the destruction of the first temple, and to a lesser degree the second temple, because the second temple is not seen as an equal to the first temple. It was lacking in many, many ways. So if we look at the prophecies, had we had Israel and the temple and the Davidic monarch, so to speak, and be like, how would that last 2,500 years? Irrelevant. Just as we've lasted, why can't a monarchy last? I mean, there's no nation that has lasted as long as ours in such an intact way, despite persecution. I mentioned to a few people a while back that someone once wrote to the Lubavitcher Rebbe saying, in a recent talk, you said that the Jews are this ancient people and no one else is like us. But you know what? The Chinese as a culture and a people have also been around for 4,000 years. And the Rebbe's response was, but they weren't persecuted, in that the Chinese have not had to wander the face of the earth and been attacked time and time and time again. Sure, they've had their dose of challenge, but the Chinese have by and large been able to stay in their region of the world. And while there have been revolutions, that they've come mostly from within. Whereas the Jewish people were just displaced. We moved from Africa to Europe to the Middle East. We got there because we were in Babylon, because we were in Israel, because we were in Egypt. So it's pretty miraculous that we're still around. Had we stayed a believing people, a loving people, a trusting people that really had each other's backs, that genuinely loved and cared for one another, that truly lived a spiritual reality, not just a religious reality, but an enlightened reality, then we never would have lost the temple, and we wouldn't have faced any of the persecution or the challenge. All the persecution and the challenges that we face are because we have been a wandering people since the destruction of the temple. We haven't quite found home. Even today with Israel, we still don't have a home. We're still a restless people. Israel is not a safe place. It's still it's a very good place, but it's still not a perfect place. There's still many, many issues within its borders, many threats that exist from outside of its borders, and many Jewish people who don't live in Israel, like us. And we're exposed to all sorts of other elements. I mean, thank God no one's throwing stones at our house and we can walk the streets freely. But the world is not a perfect place. So and has never been a perfect place, and that imperfection has ebbed and flowed, and so therefore all tragedies are pegged on the fact that the temple was destroyed, and therefore Tisha B'Av still circulates around that original point, because from there is where all other tragedy has continued to emanate, so to speak. That was a very long answer for Harry. Or to Harry, not for Harry, I'm sure. It wasn't too long.
It was a great answer. We loved it.
Thank you. All right. So any other questions before we sign off for the night? Well, that's cool. So we'll talk more tomorrow at the Parsha class. And next week, I may have to push off our guest presenter, or I'm going to have to talk to him about the guest presenter, my co-conversationalist, because I do have a very important topic that I do want to discuss with the community, which is the evolution of Jewish law, the philosophy of Jewish law, and changes to Jewish law, so that we can really get our heads around this idea of orthodoxy and Zoom over Yom Tov. And in order to do that, we must look at the historical events that took place 250 years ago with the birth of Reform Judaism and its impact on Judaism, and then the birth of this concept called Orthodox Judaism. And if we can understand what happened there in history, we can dispel a whole lot of myths about modernity. And if we can also explore the nature of belief and what is it that Jews actually believe, and why is it that we're having such a hard time approving Zoom in Shul on Shabbos or Yom Tov, I think we're all going to walk off all the wiser, not necessarily more happy, but all the wiser. So, and I do want to discuss that. Definitely my mate can weigh in on that, but we'll see if he wants to talk about that with me, because he's actually doing some fascinating research. He's doing a PhD in something that I will wait to share with you. It's one of probably the most interesting PhD being done in Australia, at least from a Jewish perspective. All right, I'll tell you what it is. He's doing a PhD in the Jewish court systems of Australia, how the Beth Dins have evolved, how they have related to common law, and what is the history of how the Beth Dins in Australia came to be, and how they and their relationship with the English Beth Din going back to the 1850s. So I think there's some interesting stuff there. Anyway, until then, good night.
Good night, Menachem.
See ya.
Good
Thanks
night.
for being here.
Thanks
Thank
for having
you.
us.
Bye. See you, Edna. See you, Michael. Alex, Ben, Caroline and Harry, Dev Rothberg. See you all.